We apologize sincerely to all the participants as we had to postpone this webinar scheduled to be held originally in May on account of a cyclonic storm Amphan devastating the southern parts of Bengal, including the city of Kolkata, sending all kinds of connectivity for a toss. As you can see that even today we had some problems starting with this webinar. We once again sincerely apologize for this. We hope that today we shall not have any more problem with the connectivity issue. Now, before I introduce you to the two distinguished speakers of today's webinar, let me say a few words about CRG, as some of today's participants may not be familiar with this organization's research activities. Set up in 1996, CRG is an institution of eminence conducting cutting-edge research, dialogue and advocacy, mainly on the issues of migration and forced migration studies, citizenship, autonomy, women's dignity, human rights, social justice, peace, borders, and other themes pertinent to democracy and governance. Developed primarily as a forum of public activists and socially committed researchers, this institution, relying on dialogues, has been able to develop a strong network of scholars, activists, and institutions, not only in South Asia, but also beyond it. On the basis of rich experience of in-depth research on forced migration and displacement of population, 17 years ago, CRG started organizing the annual winter course on forced migration. For the first 10 years, the orientation course of 3 months duration comprised the 15-day face-to-face workshop held normally during December 1 to 15 every year in Kolkata, preceded by 2.5 months of distance education, communication, and online discussions on study materials, tutorials, and course assignments given to the participants, selected mainly from South Asia. After a decade, we took a pause and redesigned and shortened the course for advanced level participants, and now the 3 to 4 day annual workshop is normally followed by a conference on migration and forced migration studies. We all are aware of New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants 2016, which recognized that existing international regime of refugee and migrant protection required a fresh push towards strengthening measures for protection. Accordingly, 2 new global compacts, one each for the refugees and migrants, were adopted by the United Nations. In November 2018, Calcutta Research Group, in its annual conference, adopted the Calcutta Declaration in presence and with active participation of academics, activists, and functionaries of international institutions from 18 countries to bridge the gap between promises and paradoxes that New York Declaration had come with. This year, CRG, like the previous 4 years, is going to have its 5th annual research and orientation workshop on global protection of migrants and refugees during November 23 to 28. This year's workshop will be organized in collaboration with Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and Institute of Human Sciences, Vienna. And today's webinar is an integral part of CRG's ongoing research program on migration and forced migration studies. As part of this year's program and in view of the global pandemic, CRG has published the electronic version of a book entitled Borders of an Epidemic, COVID-19 and Migrant Workers, edited by Professor Ranabi Shamadar. This online publication by CRG is based on the reflections of journalists, social scientists, social activists, legal practitioners, and thinkers, which highlight the ethical and political implications of the epidemic in India, in particular for the migrant labor. This book was written as the crisis unfolded with no end in sight. While it is a tract of the time and documentary in nature and purpose, its companion volume, Burdens of an Epidemic, a policy perspective on COVID-19 and migrant workers, published recently by CRG and edited again by Professor Ranabi Shamadar, is a policy perspective of the contemporary situation. Having said that, let me now begin today's webinar on COVID-19, public health crisis, and sudden visibility of migrant workers. Today's speakers perhaps do not require any introduction. However, it is my honor and privilege to briefly present these two distinguished speakers. Today's main speaker is Professor Ranabi Shamadar, currently the CRG Distinguished Chair in Migration and Forced Migration Studies. He, he was earlier the director of the Calcutta Research Group and belongs to the School of Critical Thinking. He has worked extensively on issues of justice and rights in the context of conflicts in South Asia. His areas of research have spread over a wide horizon comprising migration and refugee studies, the theory and practices of dialogue, nationalism and post-colonial statehood in South Asia, and new regimes of technological restructuring and labor control. His recent publications include Rohingya in South Asia, People Without a State, the post-colonial inquiry into Europe's state and migration crisis, neoliberal strategies of governing India and ideas and frameworks of governing India. His forthcoming book is The Post-Colonial Age of Migration. His writings have signaled a new turn in critical post-colonial thinking and have challenged some of the prevailing accounts of the birth of nationalism and the nation-state. Today's second distinguished speaker and discussant is Professor Shomita Sen. Dr. Sen received her PhD degree from the University of Cambridge and won the Trinity College Prize Fellowship earlier. She taught history at Calcutta University and women's studies at Jadavpur University, Kolkata from 1994 to 2018. She was also the first Vice Chancellor of Diamond Harbour Women's University in West Bengal, Kolkata. Her monograph, Women and Labour in Late Colonial India, published by the Cambridge University Press, won the Trevor Rees Prize in Commonwealth History. She is a member of the editorial boards of various reputed academic journals. Shomita has also edited Global South Sefis e-magazine, the South-South platform for young scholars, from 2004 to 2014. She is now V.R. Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History at the University of Cambridge. She is also a member of the CRG. We now present today's webinar on COVID-19 public health crisis and sudden visibility of migrant workers. I would first request now Professor Ranabi Shomadar to initiate the discussion. He will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. Professor Shomadar.
Shoboshachi has already told you of the two publications CRG has come out with. As soon as the lockdown began and the quote and unquote the so-called migrant crisis appeared on the scene. And we thought that we had to respond, and it was not so much as Shoboshachi has mentioned analytical, but more kind of with all our interest in migration studies, involvement in various ways, how do we respond to such an overwhelming reality which we were all facing? So the first volume came out of that, you might say, immediate response. So it's a tract of the time. And the second one, which was a bit more difficult, and the second one is, I'm coming to this because of the reason that you will immediately see, that the second one, we thought that the contributors in their contributions have, most of them had suggestions in mind, and we thought that we could collect the policy implications of the contributions, put them in one place, and it will be a kind of a policy tract. But later on, as I started reading through the contributions and thinking of what can be a critical policy perspective, I must confess, and I had thought that I would confess today, that the idea of writing a policy brief seemed in many ways meaningless, in the sense that there are very large policy implications, and to project those policy implications, you have to again go back and see what was happening. And somewhere Foucault, in fact, mentions that there is an exercise, which is the exercise of what he calls the future anterior. In other words, that you can speak of the future, a desirable future, only when you are doing the exercise of dissecting the past. And Foucault's argument was that a genealogical exercise is not a historical exercise, but in most of the time, people have looked to the past, not to understand what was past, but to always find out what can be the future. So I don't want to go into that, that line of thinking, save to say that this was part of the reason why the policy brief that Shobhoshachi mentioned is both a brief as well as a critique. It is an attempt certainly to place or to foreground what kind of policies we would like, and that would depend on what kind of future we like, on the basis of what is it that a desirable future is suggested through our analysis. Now, the title of today's talk initially put me in a quandary: public health crisis and the sudden visibility of the migrant workers. And I had initially thought that all I would have to do is to introduce these two, volume one, probably 140, 150 pages, the other is 40, 50 pages, and speak for 10 minutes and it would be over. And then Shomita is able and she would be able to continue. But the more I thought of the title, the more I appreciated the way in which the organizers of the webinar forced me to think of whatever we have written and whatever I have reflected on little more deeply. And I will confine my remarks to that. And Shobhoshachi, please stop me the moment it's 20 minutes. I think I've already lost 5-7 minutes. One is that in general, even in historical literature, we do not find much of what you can call discussion of epidemiological moments in writing labor history. This is not to say that those who concern themselves with workers do not concern themselves with diseases. On the other hand, in refugee literature, there is a large discussion of the health problem of refugees, but those are mostly in the context of camps. There are other kinds of literature also which suggests that thinkers and historians have thought of this, but I can only say that this still remains a relatively unappreciated and unexplored domain of the critical exercise. And even though, and different people actually, if you look into the history of the Peloponnesian War, there is a very moral judgment of Thucydides as to why Athens faced the scourge of plague again and again. And he speaks of the death of Pericles, the implications of that. You read Mark's writings where he speaks of the Justinian plague and again the fall of the Roman Empire. But I think still, with all these insights before us and the moral judgment on a public disease, a public health crisis is reflected most probably in recent times by Camus' plague. And it seems to me that Camus actually mimics in many ways Thucydides on the whole moral question of why a society faces a public health crisis. But here is, the second point, that this idea of public health, and pardon me for making this observation because the time is limited, is a very bourgeois concept, at least in its origin. Starting with the late 18th century, and you may say that it is umbilically linked with the whole question of this development of city as a unit of administration or as the fundamental pillar of governance. To maintain the city, public health became one of the main pillars of governance. And this was true also, and Shomita would know much more than I know on this. But if you look into the history of the Plague Act, basically the Epidemic Disease Control Act of 1896, or you look into the history of the Bombay town planning, again you can see the whole idea is how do we immediately cleanse the city of plague and its roots so that the city can become a clean space for trade, commerce, etc. And a rough estimate is that almost 300,000 laborers left the city of Bombay, Mumbai today. At the time, I think, again, equally important is that the first indication or the first reflection or the outburst of the militant nationalism again uh, uh, happened on this occasion. We all know of the Chapekar brothers and what happened. But public health then has a checkered history, the idea of public health. And the idea of public health is important in understanding the migrant question, because what constitutes the public in the notion of public health, and what constitutes health in the notion of public health. These two words, which are conjoined in making this whole universally known concept of public health, would be worth exploring if one wants to see what is the fate of or how do or do migrant workers feature at all in our idea of public health. CRG has requested three of his colleagues. I think Molosh is here, Manish is here, probably Ishita and Imon, they are also here. I do not know, but they have all agreed to write from various angles the history of public health in recent times. But under this whole, you may call the idea of the public health, which in post-colonial time began with the celebrated malaria control, because malaria was linked with the whole colonial rule. Malaria was linked with more than any other disease as the problem left by the colonial rulers for the country's people's lives. So there was enormous emphasis on malaria. But then, you know, there is the Hure committee, there is privatization and everything. There is again the public-private partnership and all that. And I think public health history again requires a serious interrogation in terms of how do these two concepts, the idea of the public and the idea of health in the public health, how do they feature? Because if you see the competing ideas like community health and others, you can see public health and the socialists, there was a definite reason why the socialists picked up the idea of public health, strengthened it. And just to mention the fact that Calcutta and today's Kolkata, largely because of the colonial framework, was one of the very few cities where there were ward-wise health officers, which was neglected in the colonial rule, completely jettisoned in the left front rule. And now, of course, I do not know even whether the present rulers are aware of the fact that Calcutta Municipal Corporation had a such strong structure in maintaining public health because of its ward health centers and the borough health offices. Think of Mumbai again, with all the devastation in terms of lives, again, something that they're doing a magnificent effort in terms of trying to control the epidemic in the Dharavi area. Out of four biggest public hospitals in the city, three are owned by the corporation, the Greater Mumbai Municipal Corporation, and only one by the state, and rest are private hospitals. And you know, private hospitals now control or account for majority of beds, which is again a different thing. I don't want to go into that. But all I'm trying to say that in the idea of public health itself, if you look deep into it, you can see the fissures, the fault lines, the kind of deep cleavages that only through, let us say, sometimes superhuman effort of certain municipal officers, certain political administrations, socialist-minded, left-minded, who really tried to bring this idea of public health out of its bourgeois structure and make it what in the Almaty Declaration was called Health for All by 2020. And we know what has happened. Now, the point is that why is it that this public health crisis, which is an epidemiological crisis, but which turns into a public health crisis, actually explodes on our face? Apart from the fact that there is privatization, that public health has its own history in post-independent India, as I said, which are important, but it is also for three, or let us say one reason, which is that this present crisis, and if you take the migrant workers crisis, it is the result of an interface and an overlapping of four crises, to say the least. One is, of course, the financial economic crisis. And it is wrong to say, wrong to ascribe to the 2 months or the 2.5 months lockdown for the ascribe to that the main responsibility. As we all know, the decline of GDP to laying down of workers to whatnot, industrial decline, deaths of farmers all across the plains of India. We all know what India was going through. Save in the construction and others, some of the few sectors, services, construction, and other few sectors, recycling, where it was booming. And whatever India was producing precisely because of the growth in that sector, those sectors where migrant workers, not without reason, contributed and contribute most. So you have the financial economic crisis, partly because also to which the epidemic contributes is the continuous constriction and the narrowing down of the public finance sector, and at the same time the narrowing of the credit and loan market, and we all know the restricting of welfare measures. And this is the moment when the epidemiological crisis meets with the public health crisis. But it happens at a time, whether it is because of administrative bungling or you can put it to many other reasons. I think the title precisely asks us to think of that. Why is it that this is the moment when the migrant workers crisis breaks out? So you have also contributing to the way in which lockdown, to the way in which the construction sector and other sectors are there, the way in which you have the eastern part of India, roughly you might say, which will be the labor sending region of India, and you have part of the northern, western, and part of the southern part of India. So you can say we have labor producing states and labor receiving states, whether in agriculture or in diamond polishing or in the jewelry, and certainly in orchard, plantation, and construction sector. And finally, you have also this over-centralization. Please remember that the invocation of the two acts, on one hand, the National Disaster Management Act, which is primarily a law and order thing, and the Plague Act, which is also a law and order thing, but which primarily had not the city in that sense, but let us say a city in a very, how would you put it, in a morphed sense, which had its target. These are the two instruments by which now the rulers try to control the disease. And it is in the nature of the instruments, the Disaster Management Act, in which part of the problem of the migrant workers and the entire nation lies. And to my mind, again, even though I'm reasonably aware of the very short and contemporary history of the National Disaster Management Act, but I have not come across a detailed analysis and the genealogy of the way in which disaster has been conceptualized. One might ask, why should we consider COVID-19 as a disaster and not a public health problem? And if you consider it as a disaster like a natural disaster, one, then it begets several problems of concept of policies. And if you think, which I left in the beginning, I should have told that something that comes from outside. So it is not from within the society. It's like, I had told Paula, and Paula was asking that you have enormous interest in these traveling diseases. You can see that it's like terrorism. We will never acknowledge that our society can produce terrorists. For us, the terrorists always come from outside. We shall never acknowledge that in our mode of politics, in our thinking, that violence is there. With you may support it, you may not support it, but it is not necessary, it's not given, it's not providence that it has to come from outside. Similar is the question of epidemic, that epidemics are always menaces from outside, which we have to guard ourselves from. And it's like a natural disaster, which is not given to us. And therefore, you have the almost the logical kind of conclusion that that's the way we have to do it. I now come to my last point, that if this is the overall scenario, where you find the public health crisis, where you find the late acknowledgement of the migrant question, where you find that it is only the question of the life of the society that then impels and that then propels and compels, whether it is the judiciary or the government or the political leaders, to recognize that there is a problem, tells something about the way in which public health question has appeared today. And this is where I shall end with 2-3 remarks. One, that it is important to understand that if you see the first intervention of the Supreme Court, and they appealed to Supreme Court had said that we do not want to disturb the government. It's a moment of crisis. Let it do, and we will see. Then it took up the question, and then it has again taken up the question, all in different manners. But you can again see that health has very little to do with that. It has much more to do with administrative orders, or what you might call, Rito Jyoti had called, the force majeure, or the kind of the state domain to which the court addresses and thinks that that's the way to do. On the other hand, the epidemic has placed the question of life frontally, and there is no way we can escape that. It may be that the final casualty in terms of human lives, perhaps it would be less than other epidemics, it can be more, but there is no doubt about it that there is no return to pre-COVID-19 era. It is a watershed, a very major watershed in human life. And now the challenge has come, what will be our politics? And that is why I said that the policy question was of an enormous problem to me. How does one try to find out some policy prescriptions within an order, within a structure that actually governs life in a way where it thinks that by disposing of a certain amount of life, that you can save certain other amounts of life. So this revival of neo-Malthusianism with a kind of, you all know the idea of the herd immunity. You all know in which social Darwinism is working today, that if this is the ruling philosophy, that it's a variety of social Darwinism, that it is neo-Malthusian in its policy, that it wants to always calculate that a certain number of deaths are necessary to then recognize that that's the way to save certain lives. Is that the way we are going to approach life today? That would mean, as I was jokingly I've told, that this is a virus against the old people. It is a war against a section of population which will be sliced off the world population in terms of saving the rest of the world population. Is that the way we want to look at the question of care, look at the question of life? So I think the migrant question had never been connected so much to the broader question of what do we mean by social life? What do we mean by life of a collective? How do we govern life? And where, therefore, is the place of care? Now, care being commodified in a way where care becomes an industry, we can see what is the situation of care. We can see in Britain what has happened, where old people languished, left completely by the people who ran away in scare, and they were found dead after a week, after 10 days. This happened in Madrid. This had happened in the outskirts of the major cities of Great Britain. So philosophers are now, of course, going the anarchist way. But that's where I wouldn't conclude. I would rather say that to defend public health and to defend a new attitude towards life, to say that the way you can see the basti workers who actually defend themselves, and you can invoke Foucault's title that society must be defended, where you can find the elders of a settlement taking up the duty of defending their community, where migrant workers are asked to wait outside. This regulation calls for a public power of a different type, which can make large-scale behavioral changes precisely because the people would have trust in that power, that power is interested in saving my life. Only I trust the doctor because I know the doctor is there to save my life. But if I do not have trust in the rule, then the ruler says, why don't you cover your face? Then I will say, what's the point? It is better that I would earn for a day, and if tomorrow I die, I die. That question will not arise only when we are convinced that the power that is there in guiding the public is a power that cares for life. So I think the philosophy of life and the question of life itself has become so much important that actually forces the migration question today in front of us. So it is, in a way, if one goes back to Grundrisse, in Grundrisse, Marx' rough draft on capital, Marx actually says life itself. That famous phrase of Marx where he says that the question of labor is the question of life. And I think never in Indian history had this been so much, sharply formulated as it is happening today. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shomadar, for a very interesting presentation. And as we can see that Professor Shomadar has flagged a few interesting points in his lecture. And he has mentioned that the interface between epidemiology and labor history. He has also indicated that can the public health or should public health be the main pillar of governance? And he has also mentioned that when we talk about public health, what constitutes public and what constitutes health in that formulation. And also, he has looked at the question of public health in the post-colonial and in neoliberal times. And having said that, he had also raised a few questions, and he has mentioned, he has mentioned the maiden intervention by the Supreme Court of India, and what will be, the policy now. In these times of revival of neo-Malthusianism, and also when we are living in a time of in a variety of social Darwinism. And is it a war against a section of population? So having said all that, I would now request Professor Shomita Shen, who is the discussant today. And as I say, Professor Shen is Veer Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History in the University of Cambridge. And I would request now Professor Shen to make her comments and also reflect on Professor Shomadar's presentation. Professor Shen.
Let me start by thanking CRG, the organizers, the people, the group within CRG who's organized this webinar, for giving us the opportunity to meet. Even if it's only on screen, it is still a wonderful break from our long lockdown fatigue. To meet everybody and to exchange notes. Let me start where Professor Shomadar left off, with the question of life and death. And to say that from late April and in early May 2020, we saw a spate of death of workers at a time of the pandemic when death is so close to us. We saw death of workers by means other than COVID, not by the pandemic, but for other reasons. Now, the nadir of this was reached on 8th of May when 16 workers were run over when they were sleeping on a railway track. We got a huge outpouring by even usually uncaring middle class. And we got a headline. This headline was called Reverse Migration. And it was reverse migration and the mobility caused by this reverse migration that in fact became the cause of death. So mobility itself, so not only was the pandemic posing death to a population, mobility itself became death to the population. The nation was gripped by images of movement from city to village and by crowds of people walking thousands of miles. And there was two things that really captured imagination, the public imagination. It's the degree of desperation that was palpable in these stories, and the scale of mobility, which the numbers involved was something we had never seen before. But in all this that was new, there were old habits that kicked in, that died hard. And what we got from watching these events was an old polarization, or a polarization that can be slotted into old boxes. And that is the old push-pull box. There was one school of thought, and I've been hearing this afternoon from another webinar, which emphasizes what is this reverse? How do we explain this reverse migration? Why are people trekking from city to village? So one group are talking about how the pandemic, the fear of death, is causing an emotional pull back to the home, back to the village home, a response to crisis, an explanation in which family and kin relationships become very, very important. The village, the real home where people will go back in a crisis. And then there is the push theory, which is totally unwilling to accept this explanation and argues that this reverse migration happened because workers were pushed out of the city, pushed out by loss of employment, wage, housing, pushed out because the city was inhospitable. An EPW article says that this has been a radical loss of trust of workers in their employers. And it is a radical loss of trust, which will mean that this is an irreversible reverse migration. That is to say that workers will not come back to the city. They have left for good. Now, I will say to this polarization in the debate, that at one level, this polarization has happened. We have, in fact, this has attracted our attention so much because of the concentration, because of the scale. That is why we are paying attention to a phenomena, the scale and significance of migration in our country, which many of us, not in CRG, but in the wider public sphere, have actually not paid enough attention to, have not seen. So that is why we are gobsmacked, and this has not been part of public discourses. As a historian, I have to point out that in fact, this is very much a continuity with long established patterns, historical patterns that have been traced by many historians over the last 2-3 decades. And I will point out to Ronabirda also that in fact, it is historians of labor in Bombay, particularly of cotton textile industry, including my supervisor, now no more, Professor Dr. R.S. Chandavarkar, who actually pulled together studies of labor and studies of epidemics. So he actually did a lot of work looking at the plague and looking at labor movement. And if you look at this literature, this genre of literature, then you will not call this reverse migration. In fact, you may not even call it migration. It is part, in fact, of a long-established circularity. And what we are seeing is one aspect of a circulation which happens all the time. It just doesn't happen all together at one time. What we are seeing today is dispersed movements concentrating into a very short period of time into a singular unilinear movement. So this dichotomy, this polarization that we are posing to the question, in fact, is false. What we have in the pattern of migration that we have in the Indian context the rural-urban migration has always been circular and cyclical, and we are seeing a particular aspect of this circularity as a response, as a very, as a huge scale of response to a major crisis. So in what direction then can we take this insight? And I will argue that what the direction in which we can take this insight is to ask questions about the nature of circularity. And to me, what is really significant in that nature of circularity is its dynamic relationship with informality. You have seen, probably most of you will have seen, that the media, even scholars who have been writing and talking about these, have all wildly different numbers that they put to the phenomena of migrant workers and to this reverse migration. Now, why, ask yourself, do we not have figures? We don't have figures despite the fact that we have regulation. In fact, it's one of the migration is one of the things for which we have an act, the Interstate Migrant Workmen Regulation of Employment and Condition of Services Act 1979. And I read out the whole title of this act because so few people know about its existence. A 1979 act, which until this new crisis broke on us, very few people registered existed. And this is because it is perhaps one of the least enforced labor laws in the country. Now, this law actually provides for registration. And if in fact this registration happened, then we would have had much more precise numbers of migrants than we have today. And what is registration as a device? Registration as a device is the basic condition of any kind of regulation. So by not following the provision for registration, what we have done is to push migration and labor migration, the whole of it, into a domain of non-regulation, or in other words, informality. And it is under these conditions that informality best thrives. Now let's connect this to another thing that Professor Shamadar mentioned. Is this migrant crisis something that happened because of the pandemic? If we connect some of the main features of the migrant crisis, then we realize that no, it is actually not so. I mean, it is in a sense the culmination of processes very much already in operation. And I would point to one other feature of informality that is in great debate at the current moment, and that is the action taken by some state governments to dilute labor laws as they currently exist. We know that in the period just before the pandemic, in fact, in India, unemployment was already at record low. But after the pandemic, whatever little assessment scholars have been able to make, Azim Premji University has given us a few figures. What they report is 67% lost employment and 80% in urban areas, and 90% decline in income. So this is not just a crisis, this is the cessation of work as we know it. In a labor market where there are no jobs, this is a strange response. Why should the state need to dilute labor laws when the pressures of the market are so huge? And this is not only the unemployment caused by the pandemic is not specific to India. We are seeing this across the world. We are seeing bizarre numbers emerging, for instance, from the USA. So why do these things, why does such a crisis in the labor market have to be met or dealt with by the relaxation of labor laws on behalf of the state? And I would argue that this intervention by the state is another means of expanding informality, of blurring the boundaries of formality and informality. And just to connect that to the migrant crisis, one of the features of the Interstate Migration Migrant Workers Act is that it has a provision that says that you cannot pay migrant workers less than local workers for analogous work. So there is an attempt here to regulate wages of migrant workers. And this is one of the issues that is going to be addressed by the dilution of these labor laws. And in fact, interestingly, match this also with the strange step that the Karnataka government took of not allowing migrant workers to leave Bangalore. So in fact, it is a situation in which there is both demand for labor and huge unemployment. So there are paradoxes in the way the labor market is being shaped by the pandemic. I'm running out of time, so I'll just finish with two questions that I think emerge from Professor Shamaddar's discussion. One is the question of how do we characterize this reverse migration. There is one suggestion that we think of this as resistance. Can we think of people leaving the city for, so it's kind of the argument about loss of trust could be stretched to understand this as resistance. And Nitin Sinha, in one of his articles, has suggested that we think in terms of the political subjectivity of migrant workers. But to look at political subjectivity of migrant workers and to place it in a historical context, we have to include the fact that politics in many cities have actually been defined as against the migrant. Since we are talking about Bombay, the rise of the Shiv Sena, which is now the government in power, the majority, the party from which the chief minister, current chief minister is drawn, is a party that actually defined its politics, that grew by its anti-migrant politics, the migrant as the other. So, in a sense, the politics of migration cuts in very many different ways. I would also invoke here Ritu Jyoti's one argument Professor Shamaddar has invoked. The other one I will invoke is his idea of enfranchisement of migrants and to allow them to have political power in terms of elections. But at the end of the day, I think what really fundamentally many of this poses to us, and I will end where Professor Shamaddar also ended, which is the consideration of the theoretical understanding of the relationship between living labor and abstract labor. How do we think of the laboring body when faced with death? And I think it's an interesting moment where actually life and labor are for once not converging, Professor Shamatha. And for me, this is a moment in which, perhaps not many moments, in which labor and life diverge, where the laboring body is pulled in opposite directions by the imperative of life, of health, and of labor. Both are survival questions. Both labor and health or life are survival questions. But these are no longer survival questions that pull you in the same direction. These are survival questions now that are pulling you in opposite directions. And in a sense, this opposition is the figure of the reverse migrant. So when policymakers ask the question, why are these people returning home? What will they do when they go home? That may not be the question they are asking themselves. And how do we actually address that element of new thinking in our theoretical frames of labor? Thank you.
Thank you, Shomita, for your excellent presentation and your comments, which are really important for today's webinar. And Shomita has identified the question, she has highlighted the question of life and death and the old push-pull box or old polarization. That question has been raised by Shomita. And she has also highlighted the question of return migration and the people, the migrant labor going back to their family and kin relationship where their home is. And it is a return from inhospitable cities, lacking public health facilities and irregular wages and other things. She has also flagged the question of the relationship between structure of labor and structure of epidemic. And highlighting also very importantly that why in these times of pandemic different state governments have been diluting the labor laws during the pandemic, and when there is this huge risk of unemployment and there is also a huge pressure of the market. And she has concluded mainly with the question that how do we really characterize this kind of return migration at this point of time. Now it is open to discussion, and we have several questions coming from our participants. And let us begin with a couple of questions, and I mean either of you can answer that. The first question is problem of migrant labor a problem of cities? And who decides which lives will be indispensable? It's over to Professor Shomadar or Professor Shin. An answer, and then we can take up more questions.
I'm going to address the first question, and I would say that it's not in the context of the pandemic today. Our attention is on migration from village to city that happened in the past and now happening back from city to village. But migration is not at all only about cities. In our country, much larger numbers of people migrate from the countryside to the countryside. So seasonal, interstate, rural migration is far higher in number than rural-urban migration. And of course, my own bugbear, which is that the largest migration in India, 70% of migration is by women. And this is classified usually as marriage migration and is not necessarily rural-urban migration, though there might also be rural-urban migration. However, in the current context, the problems of migration that we are encountering the issues that Ranveer, Professor Shamadar is talking about in terms of policy brief, that is the city. That focus is the city.
Ronavita, would you like to come here?
Yes, my understanding of these two questions is on the question of cities. I think it is important to understand that cities are playing an increasingly, important would be an understatement, but increasingly fundamental role in constituting modern governmentality. How you govern the country and how do you manage to keep the people in the way we want to keep them. This whole thing, even in terms of agriculture, trade, logistical operations, cities are the nodes around which all kinds of things would be organized. So, and as I said, that because this idea of public health is so much related to the history of the urban, as you may say, that it is this idea of the urban which then governs the lives of whether it is city or town or village or everything. So it is not so much a question of whether migrants are more connected with cities, but it is simply that they will appear as quote and unquote migrants, and as a question of economy, as a question of governance, is linked to the way in which these cities play their political and economic role, but much more government in the scheme of governing. The second thing is that even in migration, as more and more the logistical operations assume significance, so think of the vast railway network. When I was writing The Marginal Nation, I had studied, and I faintly remember I was writing on Kishanganj railway station. How from distant parts the peasant migrant knows that this is the train station they must reach, and then the El Dorado opens up from there. Then that is the way in which you can then reach any part of the country. So what you find in the railway stations, think of what happened in Mumbai, the bus station in Delhi. Think of the repeated lathi charges in Surat, in the industrial town near there. Or think of any other. It is the major assembly points. This actually modulates how the workers will be organized, how their protest will be organized, and let us say how they will begin their journey, how they will converge at a place, how transportation will be organized, etc. So I will conclude on my reflection on this, that you see this famous phrase of autonomy of migration. Migration becomes an autonomous act. And we may concede that the government, and I think the government never even thought that there were so many migrant workers. The migrant workers are like typically the invisible labor, which is always to be requisitioned when necessary. Otherwise, they are not visible, they don't count politically or anything. And they are even as the vanishing mediator even in the creation of wealth. Because precisely this wealth is much more rent-seeking wealth. On the other hand, if the migrant has to be autonomous, the migrant has to then converge at some point. And what is the place else than the urban, which then gives the migrant the opportunity to converge and to take the next step, which is to step out. And it's a declaration of a strike. We walk off. And we walk off suddenly within a span of 7 to 10 days, millions. They walk off from different parts, as if there is a kind of some organizer from heaven who had told these millions of workers, that's the time that you should walk off. The second is who decides. I think, again, it's a question of neoliberal governance. Now, but again, who decides and what happens is an important thing, because, more than a decade ago, when I wrote, why is it that the interstate migration and migrant act that Shomita mentioned, why was it being neglected, etc. I think it's partly the answer lies therefore in the structure of economy. But I think for me, more important is how rulers govern and how do they decide to govern. Partly it will be determined by epidemiological nature, precisely because we still do not have an answer to COVID-19. And we know that, as everyone is saying, that almost 70% have comorbidity. In other words, if your body is weak, if it is on the downward journey, then it's an infection to which we still don't have any answer. Therefore, it immediately cripples us. By itself, it may not be the most dangerous, infection. We do not know anything about that. In fact, the result that without any medicine, without any, in that sense, confirmed curative mode, still people are getting out of it, shows that only one section of population will be the victim. So partly it is epidemiology. But partly, as I said, it is given by the other three crises. So that's why, for me, it's very important that the present critical moment is an epidemiological moment, but it's this epidemiological crisis is governed actually by the interface of two, three other crises. And certainly the structure of public health will be very important in terms of deciding who stays alive and who finally has to depart at this moment of time.
There is a related question to this, that the problem of whether problem of migrant labor is a problem of the cities. Now, there is a question that in the politics of number, when survival, as Giorgio Agamben has recently pointed out, is the sole aim of the society, then migrants and refugees will be left out of this fold. So the question is, do you agree with this? How do you reflect on that? Professor Shomadar.
I think it's a very important question, and I by and large agree that in terms of dispensability, I think the migrants and the refugees by and large will be left out, because if you see the way in which the refugee health discussions were conducted till that time, it was all a question of how you turn the camp into a site of economic activity. And if the camp has to be a thriving site of economic activities, small production, retail business, etc., then the camp has to be, in a way, a safe and clean place. But in terms of a crisis like this, I think this whole question of, as I said, the new Malthusian policies will come back, where it will be ultimately decided who are the dispensable today, and certainly refugees and migrants in a big way will be. But there is one caution, that we should not overstate the case, because in as much as God didn't, make it compulsory that you have to have a migrant in order to begin something, but on the other hand, the appearance and the availability of migrant labor, whether you call it the reserve army of labor or not, is a different factor. But the fact is that the labor has to remain in this half-regulated, half-deregulated form. The labor will be summoned as and when necessary, and then will be summarily, asked to quit the scene as and when it will no longer be necessary, will be there. Therefore, those reasons which today have forced the migrants to come out on the street and to walk off, let us say, their jobs, if you put it like that, it's kind of a strike. Precisely those reasons, after 3 months, will say, where are the migrants? How we can entice them back? And the more interesting question would be, therefore, and I hope the return question on which Shomita actually spoke very well, that the return question, if it comes back to the discussion today, one can ask how this instrument of return and return partly predicated on the circularity of migration, but this idea of return, how it actually reshapes the agenda of economy. And in that sense, return is a political act. It's an act of autonomy.
Now, with this question of return migration, reverse migration that Shomita was talking about, there is one more interesting question from one of our participants now, that what is the impact of reverse migration on the local bodies or villages? Can sudden reverse migration create a burden on the rural areas or local bodies?
So in one sense, there is an economic question and there is a care question here. One of the most poignant sort of fallouts of the reverse migration has been how inhospitable rural societies have been to returning migrants. And that, in fact, has been the subject of a great deal of discussion, particularly in West Bengal. As Professor Shamadar pointed out, West Bengal is a sending state, so reverse migration has meant a huge flow of migrants returning to West Bengal. So it is not the other way around. Like, it is not as though West Bengal has to resend migrants; it has to receive migrants. And many receiving states have had many difficulties with returning migrants. And so that is one issue. And the other issue is the economic impact. And that is, in a sense, obvious. I mean, this is why I mentioned the trust, loss of trust argument, and I spent so much time on it. It is a set of circumstances that compel, propel, impel migration in the first place. So obviously, rural economies cannot sustain the returning migrants, and that is one of the major questions of the future that Professor Shamadar, and indeed, if we want to write policy briefs, one of the major issues we have to tackle is that.
Now, there is a question specifically for Professor Shamadar. Does the social Darwinism and the callous neglect towards certain sections of population, including migrant workers, show that Foucault was wrong in assuming the commitment to fostering life after under neoliberal governance? Or is there a difference between the neoliberal logic in the European and post-colonial contexts?
Yeah, I want to reply, but I want to also take this opportunity to, make few remarks on the return, and they're in a way connected. You see, for me, the return question is a question of the political moment, and the political articulation of this whole act of return makes it a social question. So unless we have the epidemiological crisis as the perspective, the concrete relevance and the particular relevance of this whole significance of, or the relevance of the significance of return will not be fully understood. That it is happening in the context of not merely an economic crisis, or probably not primarily because of an economic crisis, but precisely because of what is termed today as the public health crisis, the question of, would we leave? If we are here, what will happen to us if we are subjects of infection? Who will protect us? Where shall we get food? So these are not mere question of joblessness, but it is something that now the disease has brought face to face. The worker is now confronting the whole question of life. Now, when the worker returns, and this is where I have a slightly different take on that, is that where does the worker return? And if you recall Derridian argument of there is no return, there is only re-turn. You are making one more turn. In the sense that if you look into the practices of West Bengal, which Shomita was rightly referring to, and I have been particularly interested in reading as much as possible and listening to stories, trying to understand that there is a variety of practices of the, you may say, the host community and the host family. I was referring to the Basti settlements. Now, how, if you ask how in Calcutta, the Basti settlements are still by and large free of protecting themselves. You can find the dons of these slums, you can find the elderly people, you can find the clubs who overnight have erected barricades, who have created gates, who are policing the bastis, governing the lives of the local people, including the thousands of maids who have to go out each and every day to earn their living. Even when they leave the basti, when they have to come back, what will be their public health practices, how they will wash their hands? Because the common facility of washing, bathing, other activities, or how would you do it so that you can leave? Because they know that social distancing is not possible. Now, this is how life is being governed at the micro level. This is what you would call the capillary form of power. The migrant returns to that. And while human rights activists will always say, oh, the migrants have been subjected to this and that, that's not what is happening. In fact, in most of the cases, what is happening in that, including the panchayats, all the local institutions of power, they are now telling the migrants, okay, you have to remain in the orchard for 15 days. There are stories where migrants have been kept waiting in the boats. There are stories where migrants have been erected some sort of makeshift beds on treetops. There are innumerable, unbelievable stories about how local communities are receiving the migrants, because precisely the return is not simply a return. It is something which is being articulated at this particular moment of politics. So its articulation is important. And then some of the migrants do not return because they find, oh, we can get other jobs. And again, impossible to do some kind of ethnography at this moment, given the limits of the whole disaster management thing. But on the other hand, whatever is being collected, one can see that some of the migrants are again leaving for new jobs, not in anguish, and not there thinking that this is a new exile, but simply because let us earn some money and we will come back and we will support our families, because the families are within those, how would you call it, the gated communities. So this whole idea that society has to be defended is something that is being invoked and practiced. And migrant labor is crucial because migration is, again, it is crossing borders. It is crossing boundaries. The whole autonomy of migration, meaning the decision to cross one boundary after another. And if this is not labor, then what else it is? Labor means precisely this, that one particular form of living labor is not enough, that you have to find another form. And I think this is in some way related to the way in which life is being seen today. And the question is right. I will limit myself to one line answer, which is that Foucault had thought of too much of a disjunction between the quote and unquote, the pre-modern time, which valorized the power to confer death on humanity or on mankind or on people, and modern life, liberal democracy, actually guaranteed life. But I think that is where we have earlier studied that Marx's whole argument about Malthus and comparing Malthus with Ricardo, and there are many other things that tell us that you guarantee life only by guaranteeing some amount of death. And that is what we wrote in our first tract, that governments today have the power to confer life only by adjudicating the number of deaths. So that's where I think Foucault has to be qualified. And Foucault has to be qualified because Foucault had, again, made too much of a distinction between what he called the leper state and the plague state. In case of leprosy, he said that the state had developed by externalizing the whole problem and by expelling people. And the modern state develops typically by controlling plague, in the sense by including and then having surveillance and guaranteeing people's lives. I think Foucault probably, did not make or did not, account for the fact that the interface of the two strategies is very crucial in running the state today.
We cannot take any more questions because we are running short of time. And I thank both the speakers, Professor Shomadar and Professor Shen. We have many more interesting questions we have to leave out. We just had CRG's first webinar on COVID-19, public health crisis, and sudden visibility of migrant workers. I'm not going to repeat or summarize what the two eminent speakers have just said now, but I shall end with the hope that the sudden visibility of migrant labor in India with the outbreak of the epidemic will henceforth encourage the government, civil society organizations, academics, and media who work relentlessly to restore the basic rights and dignity of these untiring people who make the country run. I am taking the liberty of concluding this webinar with a few lines penned by famous Indian poet Gulzar. महामारी लगी थी, घरों को भाग लिए थे सभी मजदूर कारीगर, मशीन बंद होने लग गई थी शहर की सारी, उन्हीं से हाथ पांव चलते रहते थे, वगरना जिंदगी तो गांव ही में बोकर गाए थे. The epidemic had struck. Laborers and workers were running towards their homes. Machines in the city had stopped working. The ones that were responsible for their livelihood, the ones for which they had left their lives behind in their villages. मरेंगे तो वहीं जाकर जहां पर जिंदगी है. महामारी लगी थी तो घरों को भाग लिए थे सभी मजदूर कारीगर. We'll go and die at the place where there is life. The epidemic had struck. Laborers and workers were running towards their homes. We thank all the participants for taking part in this first webinar, which is part of a series which will be organized by the Calcutta Research Group with the help of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung and the Institute of Human Sciences, Vienna. And we look forward to meet you again. There will be more interesting speakers, including working journalists, media persons, social activists, as well as, of course, the academics. So we see you all again, and we shall communicate to you about our future webinars. And please also visit our website www.ncrg.ac.in. Have a nice evening. Thank you once again. Bye.